Will there be electric power to meet future needs in Upper Michigan? How will communities cope with the loss of revenue as a result of the big box store tax crisis? Will emergency medical responders be there when we need them? Important questions, but are there answers? We'll find out this morning as we talk with Senator Tom Casperson.
From TV6, this is The Ryan Report. Now, here's your host, Don Ryan.
You know, there's an old expression that says it's just like riding a bicycle. The idea being that once you learn to ride a bike, you never forget. And that same idea can be applied to other situations where someone is doing something they've done many times before, but not for a while. I'm not sure it applies to hosting a television news interview show, but I've done this literally hundreds of times before, and now we'll find out together if it's just like riding a bicycle. I say that because the last time I hosted this show was almost 7 years ago, when I left to serve for 6 years as a member of the Marquette City Commission. I was glad to serve, but now I'm very happy to be back sitting in this chair, and I'm glad you could join me. Also very pleased to have our first guest with us today to kick off this new series. State Senator Tom Casperson was a guest on the show the last time around, although at that time he was a state representative. Senator Casperson is Upper Michigan's most senior legislator, having served for 6 years in the House and now in his 5th year in the state Senate. Senator, welcome along on our first bike ride.
Good to be here, Don. I'm honored to be here.
It's really nice to have you back. A lot of things to talk about, a lot of things going on, but I know this week you just came back now for the recess after Easter. Did you have a chance to get away and get a break, or were you pretty much busy the whole time?
I did. The first week I spent in the UP. I traveled around the UP, did a lot of time up in Houghton, over towards Ontonagon, Gogebic County, Ironwood. So I spent the time over there because it's hard to get over there because it's so far away. So I did the first week there. I have to admit the second week I did spend a little time up at the cottage, kind of reopening the cottage up by the Munising area, and okay. They still got a foot or two of snow, or at least they did.
Yeah, it stays around. You know, we have a lot to talk about, but let's get started talking about electric power. You know, the UP and many of us really dodged a bullet that could have been very serious. The power would have been there, but it might have cost us a lot more were it not for a deal that was brokered with Cliffs Natural Resources, We Energies, UPCO was involved for a while, the governor's office, probably you. But that's not the solution, is it, for the long term?
It's really not. We did dodge a bullet, I would agree with you. It's the short-term solution, and thank goodness we got there because it was a big hurdle. And they actually came down to the wire on the negotiations to get it done, or we would have been looking at some very sharp increases in our power rates. But the good news is they did. It looks like it's something that's going to hold for now on the short term and take care of the big gap that would be created with the closure of Presque Isle. It's a little more certain now where we're heading with that, but really the long term is still in need of, and we need to keep focusing on a long-term solution for the Upper Peninsula. We think generation is the key. We need more generation. Transmission will play a role in it, but we need more generation.
Let's talk about that. There really isn't a lot of generation up here. Most of it's at Presque Isle. And under the best of circumstances, I guess, that plant probably will close or will close in 2020?
That's right now the projected time of closure. When you look at Presque Isle, it's kind of, in fact, talking to folks downstate, Consumers Energy and DT Energy, we've had multiple meetings with them. They literally were watching the Upper Peninsula in that we're the first through the gate. And what I mean by that is the concept of closing these coal-fired plants and going through a process like that with all the other things added into the mix in the Upper Peninsula that we were dealing with shows just how difficult it can be. And so they're watching down there. We got some certainty with a little longevity to it to go to 2020 that gives them time to build some new generation. But by us dodging the bullet, we were the first through. Lower Michigan's going to probably be taking our example to fix their problem coming, and it's coming because they're looking at 6 to 7 power plants being closed in the next few years.
And one of the issues we really have to deal with here is that this isn't something you can find a solution and implement it in a year. We're looking 4, 5, 6 years out.
It's absolutely right. You just do not start tomorrow building a power plant and problem solved. A lot goes into that. So as I said, we walked through it first. So far the results have been pretty good. It was real shaky there for a while, but I think the results are pretty good. And I think you'll see some more of these type of things happening now at Downstate. The good news in all of this, Don, is that now we're talking more about not just the Upper Peninsula, but downstate as well, and Michigan as a unit, as one state, and potentially getting to a solution that really solves Michigan's electrical problems.
Now, there is a plan to build a new power plant as part of this solution that we came up with. Does that look solid as far as you're concerned?
Yeah, I believe it's pretty solid. Like I said, they came down to the wire to get it done, but it appears that they've certainly gotten to that conclusion. They're going to do the short-term build of a new power plant.
And when you say we need generation, do we need more generation than that?
Yeah, I believe we do, and I think a lot of people agree with me. We need more generation, more power plants. I think what we're going to see in the Upper Peninsula probably is a targeting of power plants wherever the demand might be. If we have more mining, as an example, coming into the Upper Peninsula, more manufacturing, where we see a shortcoming of power, that'll be probably the better places to locate some power generation. Also putting in place, especially if we go to natural gas, can we get close to the pipe? Can we get as close as we possibly can to help with the cost, those type of things. So that's the next phase, start looking at those type of needs. But along with that is going to be the transmission part of it.
And we had an unusual situation here in that the mines were huge consumers. So this really large power plant was built. We probably won't see a plant of that size again, and certainly not a coal-fired plant.
Yeah, I don't see that. I think you're right. I think you nailed it as far as the need was very large back in the beginning of Presque Isle when they built it, and back then people were not talking in terms of what you hear them talking today with coal and those type of things. So I think we're looking at smaller generation plants and strategically placed.
And when we talk about transmission, kind of a new wrinkle here is you're talking, and the governor is talking, about transmission that connects the two peninsulas. Typically, much of our power in the central and western UP has come from Wisconsin. Is that a doable solution? Is there a way to accomplish what you're looking at?
We believe there is. That's more of the long-term solution, though, and it's going to take some time to get there. And we need a lot of different people to come to the table and have that conversation. The governor's mentioned it in some of his addresses when he talks about energy. He talks about it, which is good news to have the governor on board with you. The UP delegation as a whole, all of us in the UP have talked about it. We're going to continue to push for it. We'd like to see something at least put down on paper before we leave office, which is not that long away as fast as time goes, but it would be nice to see an agreement with that solution put in place. So it's not that far away, but it's a heavy lift. It's absolutely going to be a heavy lift.
You know, and power is interesting because you talk about NERC and FERC and MISO and MPSC and all these, but is there a solution that's probably going to allow more control by the Michigan Public Service Commission? Because that was one of the concerns in the recent debate, wasn't it?
It is, and that's exactly why it makes more sense. I tell people that it feels like right now what's happened is we're on the end of a power cord, and the cord ends in the UP. And so that makes us very dependent on Wisconsin and their power generation. And there's nothing wrong with that, except that if that's your only possibility, then when trouble hits, and as we saw with Presque Isle, certainly trouble hit. And that created a problem. And when you look at the MISO footprint, the way it's worked through the years, the cost sharing has always went back and forth. When Wisconsin built generation, as an example, that was probably overbilled and caused some problems for them financially, that burden was shared by the Upper Peninsula ratepayers. They paid extra because of that extra rebuild downstate, or down in Wisconsin. That was the MISO footprint, and that's how it worked. The problem we ran into was when it was our turn, when our costs were going to spike because of the unique situation between the mine and the closing of Presque Isle. That burden was going to be shared by the Wisconsin folks. And a lot of Wisconsin folks disagreed with that and didn't feel like they should have to bear the brunt of or the burden with us on that particular issue. So we saw kind of a crack in that MISO footprint, and that's why we come to the conclusion we're far better off if we can be connected to the state of Michigan and have Michigan solutions versus the partnership we've had.
We have a lot more subjects to talk about. We'll get to those in just a minute. Back with Senator Casperson after we take this break. We're talking today with State Senator Tom Casperson. We talked about electric power. Let's talk about roads. You know, in about 2.5 weeks, Michigan voters will go to the polls to decide if they're willing to raise the state sales tax primarily. I think probably everyone agrees that the roads need to be repaired. And probably most people realize we have to spend some money. I'm not sure we've convinced everyone, and I guess it's not my job to convince them even, but if they should raise the taxes in this manner. Where do you stand on this issue?
I support what we're trying to do, and I would concede, I think most people, if you ask them, they don't want to spend more money. We're human, we don't want to do that,
Right.
but I think we also understand the trouble we're faced with. The uniqueness of what we've got going down is that the state funding for the roads, the gas tax, has had a sales tax tied to it for years. And that sales tax has really created a problem for us because you've got, and it's not their fault, but you've got education and local units of government that are taking the lion's share of the sales tax that's on gasoline. That's a lot of money. That's about $900 million worth of gas tax. That's on the gas today being spent on K-12 funding and local units of government. We can't change that. That's constitutional. What we're attempting to do is separate that alliance and take schools and local units of government off of gasoline, and then we backfill it with the wholesale tax. That gets us back to where we were. It might be a little more, a little less, depending on where the price of fuel is today. But then all the money goes through the formula for road funding. On the other side of it, that's where the 1% sales tax comes in, because by doing that, and if the people support it, then we can fill the gap that we just created for K-12 education and for the local units of government with the 1% add-on. So then that's constitutionally there.
You've explained it well, but I know it still raises a lot of questions for people. In fact, I think the ballot language has 139 words. I think I remember reading that.
Sure.
And so that certainly is a complication. The fact that it involves more than just roads, although as you explained, there certainly is a reason for that. The other number that's been tossed around is that this could cost the average homeowner about $500. How do you react to that question?
Yeah, I don't see it. I don't see that to that level.
Okay.
That's pretty extreme, I think. You'd have to spend an awful lot of money or buy an awful lot of gas to make that happen. And quite frankly, the gas won't change much from what you're paying currently. It's the sales tax that changes,
Right.
and that's where the actual increase will come from
Right.
to actually backfill education. I think that number might be a little bit high. Again, I understand people don't want to pay more. We were tasked with a problem that's been there since I got into office, Don. I went in 2003, and we've been trying to solve this problem. We've had Democratic governors, we've had Republican governors, we've had chambers change majorities. We have not been able to come up with a fix, even though we know it's a problem. This is the first time we've been able to come up with the votes and an attempt to try and fix this for the long haul, and that's what I think this does.
Some of the critics, and I know some of the critics have been some of the major media downstate, some of the columnists, have said the legislature should have done this itself.
Sure.
And that's one of the criticisms. How do you react to that?
Well, it's a little frustrating because we couldn't, because we could not take the sales tax money and put it all into roads, because I hear that criticism too, that the legislature, they divert this money and they don't spend it where they say they're going to. We can't touch the sales tax. It's constitutionally put there. That was our problem all along, and the only way we could get more revenue for the roads was to just simply raise the flat gas tax, which is at 19 cents. That adds a big problem because now our gas tax would far exceed our surrounding states. That puts us in a competitive problem. So the sales tax was a problem. We had to remove it, and we have to be able to spend the money where it should be going, and that's gas tax should go towards roads.
I was going to ask if you have a plan B, but it's never a good idea before you give people a chance to vote on plan A, and that's coming up, as I say, in about 2.5 weeks.
Sure.
So, okay, a lot more to talk about. We'll get back to some more questions on some more subjects after we take one more break. Our guest today is State Senator Tom Casperson. I think we have more topics we could talk about than we have time, but let's try to do a few more. The so-called big box stores, the tax tribunal rulings, it kind of looks like it's not going to change. But there may be some things that can change for the future.
Sure.
Talk about that a little bit.
Well, the only way we're going to change this that I can see is legislatively. We need to build a coalition to do that. The UP delegation came together right away because Dickinson County was hit over there. Marquette County for sure was hit. Now we see it creeping into Escanaba. And now we're finding out it's starting to happen downstate. Folks haven't felt the impact of it yet, but they're going to, and they're going to feel it through their local units of government. They're coming up with a scenario that gives the tax tribunal is accepting an argument that says your big box stores, and what we mean by that is like your Home Depots, your Lowe's and Menards and the bigger stores, those buildings really aren't worth that much money, so they're only worth what a closed store would be. So They came up with an assessment in one case. They went downstate to a very depressed area where the store was closed down, and they come up with what the building was worth, and they're applying that to all the stores, those type of assessments, which is greatly reduced. Well, that sounds good, except the impact it's going to have on local units of government is amazing, the amounts of money we're talking, and it's spreading across the state. I disagree with the assessment because just about any building could make the same argument. You can make the same argument for just about any building. We also found out that some of these big box stores are putting deed restrictions when they walk away from one store, let's say, and build a Super Menards as an example. They can put a deed restriction on the old store that it not be purchased by a competitor. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, they artificially deflate the value of the building by doing something like that, and then come in on this side of it and say, well, the building's really not worth that much, so you should not be able to assess a tax.
So what can you do to change, what can you do to help solve the problem in the
We have to
future?
clarify the tax tribunal, the formula they're using. We have to clarify that so that it's crystal clear and identify how they come up with the value.
And for those communities that haven't experienced this, we're talking, in some cases, millions of dollars, and in some cases it builds up over several years, and then they're actually having to pay back.
They're paying it back, so they're draining the local units, their budgets right out of the get-go. So it's a problem that's going to build and grow, and we're seeing that, and that's why it needs to be addressed. And it's one of those things that might sound good initially, but it really isn't when you look at how they're assessing these buildings.
I know you have a problem with some things that are happening with EMS workers, and you certainly wanted to talk about that. What's the problem? Where's the issue?
Yeah, the real problem is with our we call first responders, and I'm getting up to speed. I'm not an expert on this, but first responders are those that are in your most rural areas. In many cases, there's not a lot of people that live there. Big Bay would be a prime example. If it wasn't for the first responders, they would struggle to have any ambulance service up there. These people are good people. They're volunteers. They're trained, and they're very good at what they do. The state keeps demanding more out of them and tries to, what appears to me, to almost make them become full-blown paramedics through the training process, and they're simply volunteers. And so the demand on them is becoming overwhelming. And they've asked for some relief. I've engaged, we've gotten involved with this, and I was originally told it was just a UP problem, but Don, I met with some folks in Gaylord. They said exactly what the folks up here in the Upper Peninsula were saying. It is a statewide problem. And rural EMS, your first responders, your people that are volunteers in your community going out and running these ambulance services are being asked an awful lot to perform an awful lot. And as I said, they are trained. But the state, the Department of Community Health, is suggesting that they get trained at even a higher level, which is putting more demands on them, and it's making it more and more difficult. We've got to find a balance.
And these are people who can walk away.
They absolutely can walk
volunteers.
away, and there's a lot of people, I've met with them, and they've been here for the conference in Marquette. About 500 people showed up, and I noticed, and nothing against gray hair, Don, but I noticed a lot of gray hair out in that audience, and we don't have a lot of young people, and we don't need to do anything to just continue to discourage young people from trying to get into this profession.
Right. If we could quickly touch on unfunded mandates. I know that's a concern of yours, where the state is really ignoring the Headley Amendment, which basically says that the state can't force local communities to spend money on projects that the state is forcing them to do.
Yeah, I think there's a little hypocrisy on the state level in that we come up with rules or laws that we pass and pass down to local units of government, and then they have to comply with it, but we don't send any money in the case of where it might cost them some money. A prime example was there was a tax credit given to 100% disabled veterans. There's nobody that wants to vote against veterans. We appreciate them, we support them, and we honor their service. So, but the state passed that law that required local units of government to give them this tax abatement where they get 100%, if they're 100% disabled, they don't pay property taxes. Local units of government had to pay for that. That came from the state. We should have paid for that, and we did not. That's why we got to balance this out.
You're in session now. You'll be in session until mid-June, probably. We only have 30 seconds left. Can we expect some big things to be happening? Answers to all these questions?
Yeah, I think we're getting closer. I think the box store issue, hopefully we'll hear more about that. We got about 4 weeks left, I think, before we actually get something introduced. I think the budgets themselves, we saw some problems with the tax credits that have been given out in the past, and now they're coming due. We got to pay for that. So you'll see some adjustments in our budget, but I'm pretty sure by the end of May and first part of June, we will pass balanced budgets, and we will move forward, and I do see good things in the future for the state.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for being our first guest as we bring the Ryan Report back to TV6.
I'm honored to be that guest. Thank you,
Okay.
Doc.
And I'll be back with some additional thoughts after we take this break. A couple of thoughts to share with you as we look back at today's report. First, there is no shortage of issues for the people who represent us in Lansing to deal with. Electric power, roads, vexing tax questions, emergency services, and the list goes on. Finding solutions will be a real challenge. Second, I've been around for a long time, and I've always been a UP political junkie, so I can't help but draw some comparisons with the past. I can look back to the days when some legendary people served us in Lansing. People like Dominic Jacobetti, Joe Mack, Phil Rahoy, Rusty Hellman, Chuck Varnum, Jack Gingras, and others all represented districts in the UP for many years. Now, they had some advantages like longevity, which isn't available today with term limits, but one of the keys to their success was also the ability they had to work together in the best interest of the region. What I think is encouraging is the fact that we're seeing this happening again today. The UP legislative delegation has learned to set aside partisanship to try to do what they believe is best for the region on those issues they believe are important to the area. Can they please everybody all the time? Never happen. But by finding ways to work together, Tom Casperson in the Senate and John Kivala, Ed McBroom, and Scott DeAnda in the House are making a difference in the state capitol, and it's made an impression on some others in Lansing. Focusing on finding solutions, working together, putting aside partisanship, maybe even Washington is watching too. Back to wrap it up in a moment. Well, as I pointed out, the state legislature is back in session after their Easter break and will continue without a break until mid-June. Expect a lot of action in the weeks ahead. Before we go today, I want to share a little TV6 history. You know, I first started working here in a whole different century and a whole different era as far as this media is concerned. It was the 1960s. The broadcast signal was in black and white, and the studio cameras we used, well, they weren't the high-quality equipment we have today, but they got us on the air. One of my responsibilities back then involved doing the weather on a nightly basis. I've always enjoyed telling people I'm not a meteorologist, but I played one on TV for 5 years. One of my favorite stories from back then concerned a letter I received from a viewer. It said, "Hey Don, watched your weather report last night, and this morning I shoveled 6 inches of partly cloudy off my driveway." I'm glad we have Carl Bonak to do a better job of forecasting today. Right now I can forecast that we'll be back next Sunday. I hope you'll join us.